The desert breathes like a furnace. Wind howls through the narrow valley, carrying sand that stings the eyes and grinds between the teeth. The smell of burning diesel hangs in the air. Thick, oily, restless. Young American soldiers crouch behind half-dug foxholes. Their helmets rattle in the gusts. Their uniforms, new, stiff, untested, are already covered in dust. Some try to light cigarettes. The flames die in the wind. Others adjust the straps of their rifles, pretending they know what's coming. Private Miller from Kansas wipes his goggles and squints toward the ridgeline. The map in his hand says the Germans are retreating. The quiet ahead seems to agree. But then, a distant rumble rolls across the valley. It isn't thunder. From beyond the haze, the earth trembles. A deep metallic growl rises, then another and another. The sound becomes a heartbeat made of steel. Tanks, panzers, Rommel's veterans moving like predators through the dust. The first shells whistle overhead and slam into the slopes. Dirt and shrapnel explode in every direction. The radio crackles with static. Confused voices overlap. Hold the line. Where's our armor? They're coming through the pass. Men scramble for cover. Some fire wildly into the storm, seeing nothing but shifting sand. Trucks jam the narrow road, colliding, blocking retreat. An M3 Lee bursts into flames, its crew leaping out as the turret cooks off. A corporal shouts orders no one can hear. The desert swallows his words. Within minutes, the neat American defense becomes chaos, a blur of smoke, fear, and fire. And somewhere amid the panic, that young lieutenant from Kansas clutches his useless map, realizing the truth too late. The enemy isn't retreating. They're coming straight through him. The storm of North Africa has begun. And no one in these dusty hills knows that this defeat, this humiliation, will forge the army that will one day liberate Europe. North Africa, early 1943. After the victories of Operation Torch, the Allies were confident, maybe too confident. American newspapers called it the beginning of the end for Rommel. Young soldiers arriving in Tunisia believed they were marching into a mop-up operation. At Allied headquarters in Algiers, maps were dotted with bright flags, each marking progress across North Africa. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the man in charge of the American Second Corps, studied those maps from a concrete bunker more than 70 miles from the front. To him, the desert seemed predictable. To the men on the line, it was anything but. Fredendall had built a fortress command post deep inside a canyon, protected by walls of rock. Officers joked that the Germans could never hit him because he was already buried. He issued long, confusing orders over the radio, referring to positions by meaningless code names like Speedy Valley or Wiggly Ridge. By the time those orders reached the front, the situation had already changed. Meanwhile, British General Kenneth Anderson, commander of the First Army, was equally sure that Rommel's Afrika Korps Assas was finished. After all, the British Eighth Army was pushing west from Libya, and American forces were closing in from Algeria. On paper, it looked like a perfect trap. But the desert doesn't care about paper. Across the lines, in a simple tent near the Tunisian town of Sfax, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, studied his own map. His lines were shorter, his supplies thinner, his men exhausted. But his instincts told him something the Allies had missed. The Americans were green. Brave, but untested. Eager, but uncoordinated. In his diary that February, Rommel wrote, "They fight bravely, but without coordination, like a fist without fingers." He could see it in their movements. Tanks charging without infantry support, artillery firing blind, radio nets filled with chatter instead of commands. He realized that against an enemy like this, speed could replace numbers. So while the Americans dug in, expecting the Germans to fall back toward the sea, Rommel was planning something no one in Allied headquarters imagined. His staff officers spread maps across a sand table, tracing narrow wadis, dry riverbeds that slice through the mountains near Kasserine. Those wadis could hide entire columns of panzers. If he struck fast enough, he could split the American forces before they even knew where he was. The sound inside his tent was steady. The scrape of pencils, the rustle of paper, the low hum of a generator outside. When he finally looked up from the map, his face was calm. "We attack at dawn," he said quietly. Back at the American lines, the mood couldn't have been more different. Soldiers cleaned rifles, joked about how soon they'd be home, and watched dust devils twist across the desert floor. Their officers believed Rommel was on the run. But the maps lied. The desert lied. The calm that settled over the valley was not peace. It was the pause before a storm. By the time the Americans realized their mistake, the first panzers would already be moving. And Rommel's plan, forged in silence, drawn in sand, was about to teach the United States Army its first lesson in humility. February 20th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Before dawn, the air is cold and silent. The stars still hang over the black ridge lines. Somewhere in that darkness, the desert fox is waiting. Then, thunder. The first German artillery batteries open a fire at 5:45. The sound rolls through the valley like a breaking wave. Within seconds, shells crash into American positions, tearing sandbags, shattering trucks, and hurling men to the ground. Private Miller presses himself into the dirt as fragments slice the air above him. The whole mountain seems to shake. The sky glows orange with tracer fire. Then comes the noise that makes every man's blood run cold. The heavy engines of tanks. Through the smoke, the panzers appear. Low, fast, and deadly. Mark III and Mark IV tanks with crosses painted on their turrets. They move in formation, flanked by half-tracks and machine gun trucks. The Americans fire back, but their M3 Lees and M5 Stuarts are outgunned. Their 75mm shells bouncing off the German armor like stones. In the confusion, the radios begin to fail. Static floods the headsets. Units call for air support. No answer. The lines are jammed. The officers shout orders that vanish in the roar of engines. A forward observer tries to adjust artillery coordinates, but dust storms and smoke have erased every landmark. His voice shakes over the radio. "We can't see them. They're everywhere." The German advance is faster than anyone imagined. Within minutes, they slice through the thin American line. A company of infantry is pinned behind a ridge, cut off by machine gun fire. Trucks loaded with ammunition and rations try to reverse down the narrow pass. They collide, blocking the only escape route. From the air, it looks like a single, twisting line of destruction. Flames, black smoke, and hundreds of men running through the desert trying to regroup. Rommel's strategy is working perfectly. He's using the terrain itself as a weapon. Striking from the wadis, disappearing, reappearing miles away. His tanks don't charge blindly. They flow, like water through cracks in stone. The Americans fight back bravely. A platoon from the 34th Infantry sets up a bazooka team on the ridge. They knock out one panzer. It burns like a torch. But for every tank they stop, 3 more push through. A soldier later writes in his diary, "We never saw them until we were hit. The desert swallowed us whole." By mid-morning, the sun turns the sand into a blinding mirror. Sweat and dust streak every face. The smell of fuel and cordite fills the air. Dead mules, burning tires, shattered helmets, all scattered across the valley floor. A captain tries to rally his men. "Hold the line. Don't give an inch." But when he looks behind him, there's no one left. His unit has already withdrawn, or worse. Rommel's troops move with terrifying precision. They strike, disengage, and strike again. American anti-tank guns, the 75mm M1, can barely scratch the German hulls at this range. The Panzer's 88mm guns answer with deadly accuracy. In the chaos, communication collapses completely. One battalion retreats toward Tebessa, another toward Thala, each believing the other still holds the pass. In reality, no one does. As the day goes on, the narrow valley becomes a graveyard of steel. Wrecked tanks, overturned jeeps, crates of rations burst open under the sun. The dust clouds rise so high they blot out the sky. From a hill overlooking the battlefield, Rommel stands beside his binoculars, silent. His adjutant notes how calm he looks. He doesn't cheer, doesn't shout. He simply nods. The counterattack is unfolding exactly as planned. The desert fox has found his opening. And the Americans, brave but unready, are learning their first and hardest lesson. In North Africa, the enemy strikes like lightning and disappears before you can even see the flash. By early afternoon, the battle for Kasserine Pass had turned into a storm of fire and confusion. The American 1st Armored Division, proud, newly equipped, and full of confidence, was being torn apart. From above, German dive bombers screamed down from the clouds. Stukas. Their sirens wailed like demons as they released their bombs into the valley below. Each explosion lifted geysers of sand and smoke. The shock waves rolled through the canyon walls like thunder trapped in stone. Lieutenant Harold Brooks, commanding a platoon of M3 Lees, tried to move his tanks into a new position. The radios crackled, more static than words. Pull back, regroup. Then silence. He looked over his shoulder. 2 of his tanks were already burning. The crews were crawling out, faces blackened with soot, stumbling for cover. He ordered the rest to fall back toward the pass, but the road was blocked. A chaos of wrecked trucks, overturned fuel carriers, and horses that had broken free from supply wagons. Smoke poured from a dozen burning vehicles, turning the sunlight red. All around him, the Americans fought, but without direction. Some fired into the haze, others ran for higher ground, only to find German infantry already there. The panzers kept advancing, methodical and merciless. Their tracks crushed rifles, helmets, and the remains of tents still fluttering in the wind. Rommel's troops were veterans, men who had fought the British across thousands of miles of desert. They moved with practiced rhythm. Advance, fire, reload, advance again. Machine gunners rode in half tracks, their barrels glowing. Mortars fell in perfect timing with tank fire. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a lesson. By mid-afternoon, the entire valley was choked with smoke. The once blue sky had turned gray and orange. American gunners fired until their barrels overheated, until the bolts jammed. A medic dragged the wounded into a shallow ditch, wrapping torn bandages with trembling hands. "Where's the line?" someone shouted. No one could answer. Further back, field headquarters tried to restore order. The map tables inside the command tent were covered in dust and coffee stains. Every phone line was dead. Runners arrived breathless, bringing fragments of reports, all bad. The 34th's been overrun. The armor's in retreat. We can't hold the pass. General Freudendahl, sitting miles away in his concrete bunker, still believed the situation could be salvaged. He ordered units to counterattack immediately. But out in the desert, there was nothing left to counter with. As evening approached, Rommel's vanguard broke completely through Kasserine Pass. German tanks rolled over captured American positions, the black crosses on their hulls glowing in the setting sun. They seized food, fuel, and crates of ammunition, all neatly stacked by the very army they had just defeated. For a brief moment, Rommel stood on the ridge and watched the smoke drifting over the valley. His officers congratulated him, but he only nodded. He knew this was not victory, not yet. His fuel was running low, and his supply lines were stretched thin. Still, he had proven his point. That night, under a moon washed pale by dust, the survivors of the American Second Corps gathered miles to the west, exhausted, filthy, silent. Some hadn't eaten in a day. Others still clutched their rifles, though the bolts were jammed with sand. Private Miller sat beside a dying campfire, his hands shaking. He looked down at his boots, coated in the same dust that had buried his friends. He wrote a single line in his notebook before sleep claimed him. "We came here thinking we'd win the war. Tonight, we're just trying to stay alive." Across the battlefield, the wind carried the faint sound of engines idling, German vehicles rearming for the next push. The desert, once quiet, now pulsed with echoes of defeat. And somewhere in that darkness, unseen by the men who fled it, the foundation of a stronger army was already being built, because sometimes the only way to learn how to fight is to lose. When the dust settled over Kasserine Pass, one truth cut through the smoke. Rommel's victory wasn't luck. It was math. The Americans had 30,000 men. The Germans, barely 22,000. Yet numbers didn't matter. Timing did. Across the desert, Rommel built his campaign on precision, the kind that could be measured not in miles, but in minutes. His panzer divisions moved like clockwork. Advance, strike, refuel, repair, move again. No wasted motion, no waiting for orders. Each panzer, mostly Mark III and Mark IV, carried just enough fuel for a few hours of combat. After every engagement, they fell back into a rotating circle of supply. Refueling took 15 minutes, repairs 30. Mechanics worked under camouflage nets, engines still hot, their hands black with oil. Within half an hour, tanks that had been smoking on the line were ready to fight again. Meanwhile, on the American side, confusion turned minutes into hours. Radio traffic jammed. Orders were repeated, rephrased, or lost entirely. Some units waited 3, even 5 hours for confirmation to move. A captured German report later noted, "They fight with courage, but wait for permission to act. We act, then report." It was the difference between a hunter and his prey. Rommel's staff turned speed into a weapon. His 22,000 men fought as if they were 60,000, because every moment was used twice. Once to attack, and again to prepare the next strike. He once told his officers, "If they take 12 hours to organize, and I take 2, I win before they start." That's simple arithmetic defined the Desert War. To keep that speed alive, Rommel relied on a system both ingenious and desperate. He stripped parts from wrecked tanks, turned captured British trucks into mobile workshops, and used fuel drums marked olive oil to fool Allied reconnaissance planes. Even the tires on his half-tracks came from salvaged American jeeps. His officers laughed about it. "The enemy builds our army for us," one wrote in a letter home. But behind that ruthless efficiency, there was a crack forming. Fuel. Every panzer burned more than 70 gallons of gasoline in a single day of battle. Supplies came by convoy from Tripoli, across hundreds of miles of desert roads under constant air attack. Each loss meant another delay, another ration cut. Still, Rommel's men kept the illusion alive. They made 2 tanks look like 20 by spreading out, using smoke and decoys. He even ordered his reconnaissance teams to drive captured U.S. jeeps at the front, fooling American sentries until the panzers were nearly on top of them. It was a psychological weapon. Confusion as camouflage. While the Germans worked with brutal precision, the Americans stumbled under the weight of their own system. Reports had to climb a chain of command that stretched from a platoon in the valley to a battalion in the hills, to General Fredendall's bunker more than 70 miles away. By the time an order returned, the battlefield had already changed twice. At one point, a request for air support took nearly 4 hours to reach the British Royal Air Force. By then, the coordinates were useless. The Germans had already moved. For Rommel, this delay was priceless. He could strike 3 times in the space it took the Americans to organize once. And so, while the Americans measured strength by numbers, Rommel measured it by rhythm. His army was a machine that ran on tempo. Imagine it, a typewriter clicking inside a tent. A German adjutant logs every movement. Tank numbers, fuel counts, ammo loads. Outside, mechanics crank engines to life. The entire desert seems to hum in sync with the sound of those keystrokes. Every strike, every maneuver, timed to the minute. Rommel's genius wasn't in the size of his army, but in how he made 22,000 men fight as if they were invincible. And for 2 long days, they almost were. But every machine, no matter how perfect, runs on something finite. And in the deserts of Tunisia, that fuel was running out. From a distance, Rommel's army looked small, 2 thin armored columns moving through a sea of rock and sand. Up close, it moved with mechanical precision, like gears inside an unseen clock. At the head of the formation, Panzer Regiment 8 advanced in a staggered line. Scouts in captured U.S. jeeps sped ahead, antennas whipping in the wind, radios tuned to American frequencies. They listened, intercepted, mimicked. When an American operator called for confirmation, a German voice, perfect English, answered, "Copy that. Hold position." Seconds later, that position was gone. Behind the scouts, the main body rolled forward, Mark the 3rd and Mark the 4th Panzers, their engines rumbling in perfect tempo. Each tank carried a single mechanic and a driver trained to strip the gearbox in minutes. Fuel trucks waited 2 miles back, hidden under camouflage nets. When the order came, they moved like blood through veins, refueling a battalion in 15 minutes. Even ammunition was measured by rhythm. Every gunner knew the count of shells fired. Every loader timed his motion to the turret's rotation. To the Americans, it looked effortless. To the Germans, it was exhaustion disguised as order. Men slept in the driver's seats, hands still on the controls. Mechanics ate bread streaked with grease. But the system worked, because it had to. Rommel's staff recorded every movement on typewriters powered by field generators. Pages of fuel charts and repair logs flapped in the desert wind. Each entry ended with the same mark, R for ready. If a tank wasn't marked by nightfall, the commander wanted to know why. That discipline created an illusion of endless strength. In reality, Rommel was fighting with a skeleton army. 200 tanks against nearly 400 American vehicles. Yet his lines cut deeper every hour. His artillery commander joked, "We make noise so fast they think there are 10 of us." Every order was timed to seconds. At 0600, flank left. At 0615, strike the ridge. At 0630, pull back before counterfire. While the Americans still argued over which hill was Wiggly Ridge, the Germans had already crossed it. The difference lay in communication. Rommel's radio net used a simple code, short, brutal words. Feuer, fire. Stop, hold, vor, forward. Orders clear enough to survive static. By contrast, American transmissions were polite paragraphs, full of confirmations, acknowledgments, and the deadly phrase, "Repeat last." Inside his half-track command car, Rommel listened to both frequencies. He could hear his own men moving like a drumbeat. Then the Americans, lost in argument. The smile that crossed his face was small, tired, and certain. The terrain amplified his advantage. The narrow wadis of Kasserine funneled U.S. units into perfect kill zones. German tanks fired downhill, their 80mm shells punching through the thin armor of M3 Lees like needles through paper. The American shells, with shorter range and less velocity, shattered harmlessly against German fronts. Each hit sent fragments spinning out through the desert air, metal confetti marking defeat. Still, the Panzers weren't invincible. Every thrust burned more fuel. Every extra mile meant another convoy from Tripoli, 400 miles of open desert patrolled by Allied aircraft. Rommel knew his tanks were racing against their own gas gauges. His men siphoned the fuel from wrecks, from captured trucks, even from planes forced down on salt flats. One officer recalled, "We fought as long as there was gasoline. When the tanks stopped, so did the war." Rommel concealed that weakness behind constant motion. He ordered empty vehicles to circle dust clouds near the horizon, tricking American pilots into bombing mirages. He used smokescreens not to hide retreats, but to suggest new attacks. To the enemy, he was everywhere. In truth, he was running on fumes. Each evening, as the sun melted behind the mountains, his logistics officers calculated the next day's arithmetic of survival. How many gallons left? How many trucks overdue? How many engines could still turn? The reports were typed, initialed, and slid across Rommel's map table. He read them without expression. Then he circled a new target in red pencil. That cold precision, the math of momentum, was Rommel's real weapon. He fought not just with tanks, but with time. And in those February days, time belonged to him. While Rommel's columns flowed forward like liquid steel, the American army moved as if trapped in slow motion. In theory, the U.S. Second Corps was larger. 30,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and nearly unlimited ammunition. In practice, it was an orchestra without a conductor. Each division had its own map, its own radio frequency, its own supply officers. Orders came from a command bunker so far away that even the dust from the front could not reach it. When one battalion requested reinforcements, the reply arrived 5 hours later, and by then, the coordinates no longer existed. A lieutenant later wrote, "We were waiting for permission to fight a battle that was already over." It wasn't cowardice, it was structure. An army built for safety, not speed. General Fredendall issued his commands through a chain of staff officers, each adding a layer of confusion. His defensive lines were scattered, his units separated by mountains, with no single point of coordination. Rommel didn't need to destroy the Americans. He only had to cut the wires between them. And he did. German signal troops jammed Allied radios, flooding frequencies with static or false chatter. They intercepted field transmissions and fed them back, sowing doubt. A tank commander who thought he was hearing his own HQ was, in fact, listening to the enemy. The result was paralysis. A modern army, deaf and blind. Even when the Americans fought bravely, their blows landed out of rhythm. One unit attacked while the other retreated. Artillery fired at empty hills. At one point, 2 U.S. tank battalions, lost in the smoke, shot at each other in the confusion. Rommel's intelligence officers listened to these transmissions and smiled. "They are fighting a war of minutes," one of them said, "and they are always 5 minutes late." In the German camps, efficiency bordered on obsession. Every bullet was logged, every ration weighed. Trucks moved in columns, spaced exactly 200 meters apart. Mechanics timed their refuels with stopwatches. To an outsider, it felt mechanical cold, almost inhuman. But in the chaos of war, that precision became survival. Rommel himself rarely slept. He moved along the front in his SD.KFZ. 250 command car, goggles pushed up, coat collar stiff with dust. When he stopped at a ridge, he would scan the horizon with his binoculars, calculate angles, distances, time. He didn't see terrain, he saw geometry. Every ridge was a lever, every wadi a funnel, every American delay a gift. By February 22nd, his forces had advanced nearly 50 miles, smashing through 2 American divisions and scattering their supply convoys. The battle map on his table looked like a living thing. Red arrows snaking west, blue lines curling and breaking. His adjutant recorded fuel status, 25% remaining. Ammunition, 40%. Trucks overdue, 30. Rommel didn't flinch. He circled one more objective. Thala, the last Allied stronghold before the plains of Algeria. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we finish it." But the desert had other plans. That night, his supply convoys were hit by British aircraft. Dozens of trucks went up in flames. Drums of gasoline exploded like lanterns in the dark. The heat could be seen from 20 miles away. When dawn came, Rommel's tanks had fuel for only one more day of fighting. And the Americans, beaten, humiliated, were finally beginning to reorganize. Reinforcements from the 9th Infantry Division and 1st Armored arrived, led by men who had survived the chaos. They dug in at Thala, supported by British artillery with perfect range. When Rommel's panzers attacked that morning, they met a storm of shells that tore through their columns. The advance that had started like thunder now sputtered, one tank at a time. Engines coughed, then died. Smoke drifted across the valley as mechanics tried to siphon the last drops of fuel from wrecks. For the first time in years, the Desert Fox was forced to stop. Standing beside his stalled command car, he looked across the empty expanse of Tunisia. His army had moved faster, struck harder, and fought smarter. But it had reached the limits of its own brilliance. Without fuel, even the best machine was just steel in the sand. Rommel turned to his aide and said quietly, "An army's strength lies not in courage alone, but in the flow of its supplies." He ordered the withdrawal. Engines coughed to life, tanks turned east, and the same roads that had carried victory now led them back into the desert. Behind him, the Americans were already rebuilding, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. In the wreckage of radios and burnt-out tanks, a new army was forming, one that would never again underestimate its enemy. And though Rommel had won the field, he had lost something more important: time. The clock that once ticked for him had finally stopped. In the last week of February, 1943, silence returned to Kasserine Pass. The smoke settled, the fires burned low, and the valley was littered with the bones of defeat. Over 6,500 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles smoldered along the mountain roads. M3 Lees with their turrets melted, jeeps overturned and burned, ration tins scattered among the empty helmets. It was the first major test of the United States Army in the Second World War, and it had failed. To the Germans, it was proof of their superiority. To the Americans, it was a reckoning. At Allied headquarters in Algiers, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in silence as reports came in. Page after page of chaos and confusion. The words "command failure" appeared again and again. Eisenhower, calm but grim, made a decision that would change everything. The man who would rebuild the broken army was already waiting. His name was George S. Patton. When Eisenhower summoned him to take command of the battered Second Corps, Patton's reputation preceded him. Strict, relentless, a believer in discipline above comfort. To the troops still reeling from defeat, he arrived like a storm. He landed in Tunisia wearing polished boots, ivory-handled pistols, and a glare sharp enough to cut steel. The first thing he did was ban excuses. Helmets on at all times, shirts buttoned, salutes crisp, orders obeyed instantly. "A sloppy soldier," he said, "is a dead soldier." Patton walked among the men like a drill sergeant and a preacher combined. "You will not lick your wounds," he told them. "You will learn from them." He restructured communications, ordered daily radio drills, and made every unit rehearse movement until it became instinct. No more waiting for orders that came 5 hours too late. Under Patton, responses were timed with a stopwatch. 45 minutes from report to action. No more. At night, his staff worked by lantern light, drawing new maps, rewriting procedures, recalculating supply flows. The Americans, who had once been scattered across the desert, were now being forged into a single machine. The difference was immediate. Before Kasserine, command had been scattered. After Patton, it was unified. Before, discipline had been weak. After, it was absolute. Before, response time was 5 hours. After, 45 minutes. The transformation was as much psychological as tactical. The same men who had fled the pass now began to march with confidence. Convoys moved in order, radios spoke clearly, and supply trucks arrived on time. The desert that once devoured them was now under control. Patton's philosophy was simple: fight like you train, Train like you fight. He made the soldiers live it. Morning drills at dawn. Tank crews practiced coordinated flanking attacks across the dunes. Mechanics rehearsed emergency repairs until they could replace a broken tread in 15 minutes. Even cooks were given orders to serve meals on the minute. The entire army began to tick like a clock. The Germans noticed. Months later, when Rommel's staff faced the Americans again in Tunisia, they were stunned. One officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans we met again were not the same as before." This was no longer the confused force that had stumbled through Kasserine. It was an army sharpened by shame and led by a man who understood the value of that shame. Patton often said, "Pressure makes diamonds." In the desert, he proved it. By late March, his troops were advancing through the same valleys they once lost. The cracked wrecks of old tanks lay half buried in sand. Silent reminders of what undisciplined war looked like. The new formations moved past them like ghosts reborn. Engines humming in perfect rhythm. And somewhere above the noise, you could almost hear Patton's voice echo. "Remember Kasserine, it's not a wound. It's a scar. And scars make men harder." By early March 1943, the U.S. Second Corps no longer looked like the same force that had stumbled through Kasserine. The helmets were cleaner, the salutes sharper, and the orders faster. Every man felt the weight of Patton's presence, a presence that could be heard before it was seen. His staff car kicked up dust down every road. His polished boots gleamed in the sun, and his voice carried through the camps like gunfire. Patton turned shame into energy. "You're not beaten," he told them. "You just haven't learned how to win yet." He pushed his officers harder than they thought possible. Tank crews practiced formation driving under live fire. Radio teams drilled until they could pass coordinates blindfolded. Infantry marched 30 miles a day under full packs, cursing the general's name, but moving faster than they ever had before. Under him, the desert stopped feeling endless. It became a training ground. Patton didn't just demand speed. He demanded unity. He linked air, artillery, armor, and infantry into one chain of motion. He created mobile command posts that followed the battle instead of lagging behind it. Fuel convoys were timed to the minute. Orders were short, brutal, and clear. Attack, advance, hold. Nothing more. The results came quickly. In late March, near a dusty ridge south of El Gueter, Patton's army faced the same enemy that had humiliated it a month before, Rommel's Afrika Korps. But this time, the Americans didn't panic. When the German panzers charged, they found themselves walking into a trap that could have been drawn by Rommel himself. American artillery, the 155-millimeter guns of the 9th Division, opened fire in perfect sequence. Tank destroyers hidden behind dunes picked off the leading panzers. The air roared with the arrival of P-38 Lightnings, strafing columns caught in the open. In the command post, Patton listened to the battle unfold through radio chatter. Short, crisp, confident. "Enemy armor halted. Range 2,000 yards. Adjusting fire." No confusion, no panic, only precision. By nightfall, the desert that once echoed with American retreat now rang with German engines dying one by one. The U.S. forces had not just held the line, they had thrown the Afrika Korps back. When the smoke cleared, Patton rode to the front. Burned-out panzers lay across the valley like fallen statues. He removed his helmet, looked at the men who had done the impossible, and said simply, "Now you're soldiers." It was more than victory. It was redemption. News of the turnaround raced through Allied headquarters. Eisenhower, reading the first reports, allowed himself a rare smile. Kasserine, once a name of embarrassment, had become the cornerstone of reform. The army that would storm Sicily, fight through Italy, and later land in Normandy was born right here. In failure, turned to discipline. Even the Germans saw it. A staff officer in Rommel's headquarters wrote, The Americans we met again were not the same as before. They have learned fast, too fast. In the months that followed, Patton's reforms spread across the entire Allied command. Officers studied his methods, his timing, his relentless focus on detail. The American army no longer moved like a bureaucracy. It moved like a living machine. Charts from that period show the difference. Aspect before Kasserine. After Patton, command scattered unified discipline. Weak, strict response time. 5 hours, 45 minutes. Every improvement was paid for in blood, and Patton made sure his men never forgot the cost. He often returned to the pass itself, the jagged ridges where so many had died. Standing among the wrecks, he'd remind his officers, "These aren't graves, they're lessons, and every lesson here was paid for in full." Then he'd turn, mount his jeep, and drive off toward the next campaign, leaving behind the echo of engines and the faint smell of oil in the wind. The desert that once marked the lowest point of the U.S. Army had become the forge of its rebirth. From humiliation came discipline, from chaos, order, and from defeat, the beginnings of victory. The winds of Kasserine Pass still blow across the Tunisian hills. If you walk there today, you'll find the rusted shells of tanks half buried in sand, and fragments of steel glinting beneath the sun. Silent echoes of a lesson bought with blood. After February 1943, the United States Army was never the same. From the humiliation of Kasserine came a transformation that reshaped not only how America fought, but how modern war itself was understood. What began as defeat became doctrine. Out of the chaos, 3 simple truths emerged, and they would define every American campaign that followed. First, no branch fights alone. Before Kasserine, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power had fought as strangers. Each spoke its own language. Each waited for permission. But in the months after the battle, that wall between them fell. The Americans learned what the Germans already knew. Victory in modern war belongs to those who move together. From that realization came combined arms warfare. The choreography of tanks, guns, and planes moving as one living machine. When a column advanced, fighters cleared the skies. When armor stalled, artillery opened the path. The pieces no longer competed. They complemented. Second, an army moves at the speed of its orders. Kasserine exposed a chain of command tangled by fear and indecision. Patton's reforms rewired it. Command became a circuit, not a ladder. Orders flowed down, reports flowed up, and decisions were made close to the fight. Radios spoke in seconds, not hours. For the first time, American officers were trained to act, not just to wait. And third, logistics wins wars. Rommel had proved it by running out of fuel. Patton ensured it would never happen again. Fuel convoys, repair battalions, field depots, all became part of the battle plan itself. In Tunisia, the U.S. Army learned that no tank moves, no plane flies, no victory lasts without a gallon of gasoline behind it. These principles became the backbone of every Allied triumph that followed. In Sicily, Patton's forces moved like a storm, racing the British across the island with air-ground coordination so precise that German observers compared it to a dance of death. In Normandy, the lessons of Kasserine lived inside every command post. When communications faltered, local officers took initiative, striking forward without waiting for approval. The ghosts of Tunisia whispered in every headset, "Don't wait, act." And in Bastogne, surrounded in the snow a year later, American troops held firm not just by courage, but by system. Supply lines rebuilt under fire, radios linking divisions across chaos, artillery and air support answering within minutes. That discipline, born under Patton's glare in the desert, kept them alive. The soldiers who once scattered in confusion now moved like an orchestra. Their rhythm, learned in failure, carried them through Europe. Kasserine became more than a battle. It became a mirror, reflecting every weakness an army could have, and the resolve to correct it. It was the wound that turned to scar, the scar that hardened into muscle. Historians call it America's baptism of fire. The men who were there had a simpler name, the wake-up call. They never forgot it. Years later, when Patton addressed his officers before Sicily, he reminded them, "A pint of sweat saves a gallon of blood." That line wasn't poetry. It was a debt, one already paid at Kasserine. Because in industrial war, failure is the only teacher that cannot be ignored. And from the dunes of Tunisia to the beaches of Normandy, every American step forward carried the echo of that first hard lesson. That even in defeat, if you learn fast enough, you can still win the world. Soft crackle of archival radio static. The voice that follows is old, steady, and heavy with memory. We lost friends, pride, and half our tanks. But after Kasserine, we never lost again. Silence. Just the faint hum of desert wind. The camera drifts over the ridges of Tunisia. Quiet now, where once the earth shook with war. Half-buried helmets, faded unit insignias, rusted steel beneath the sand. That silence is not empty. It carries the echoes of every lesson learned the hard way. Every command corrected, every life that turned defeat into doctrine. Because Kasserine wasn't just a battle lost. It was an army reborn. The first defeat that built the army of victory. Music swells, brass and snare drums, steady, resolute. Subscribe to Battle Records, where forgotten World War II lessons still echo through time.